So we have a second tonight, Arthur Mullen, who is the manager here, and he knows there's actually a fascinating history about this building, this site.
Oh, thank you so much, Ed.
So I wanted to turn it over to you to tell us, so the group here are surgeons and their spouses from the South.
Oh, fantastic to have you
So-
all. Thank you so much. You picked a beautiful Saturday. You brought some beautiful weather with you. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so thank you.
Oh,
Turn it
thank
over
you.
to
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you all about the history of this place. It's such an honor. I actually am not the manager. I work at the front desk downstairs. So they refer to me as front desk manager, but
You should be the
thank you so much. But I have been working for the past 4 years. I've been working on a bit of a passion project about the local history of this site, which was the founding father Roger Sherman's home. And from my research, I believe that the Southern Surgeons Club was began in the 1880s, and around the same time that was founded, this location became a clubhouse where local men started to gather and hold banquets and give annual toasts. And those toasts were often on the very same subject that I'm getting to speak on today. So it's just such an honor to come in this tradition and to be able to lend my own voice to this subject matter. So thank you so much for having me today. It's a true honor. And I'd also like to thank all of those that have spoken on this subject before me, because without their scholarship and what they contributed to the research, I don't think that this would even be possible for me to be addressing you today. But tonight I would like to talk to you about the first time that George Washington visited here in this site. And I'll just to back up a little bit and talk about how that came about. In 1743, when Roger Sherman was 22 years old, with no further education than grammar school and the books of his father's library, and an apprenticeship as a shoemaker, Roger Sherman's father passed away, and that triggered Roger moving from Massachusetts with his mother and siblings to Connecticut. They moved to New Milford, which is just south of here along the coast. And within a partnership with his brother William, he began to run the first store in the town of New Milford. And then in 1760, when Roger Sherman was 39 years old, Elizabeth Hartwell, who was Roger Sherman's first wife of 11 years, passed away sadly. And at that point, Roger and his brother William bought this parcel of land in New Haven across from Yale College. And they converted an existing colonial home just on the site where we are now into a store to sell books and gifts to the Yale students and professors. In 1763, which is just 3 years after buying the land here, Roger Sherman was 42, and he married the second love of his life, Rebecca Prescott. And then in 1770, next door to the store that was here already, Roger Sherman completed building a home for his wife and family, and they eventually had 8 kids. And that would have been just on the other side where the building next to us is now, called Warner Hall. And that's why they call this Sherman's Alley, between the two buildings here. And he lived in that home and lived on this land for the rest of his life with his wife Rebecca. As early as the spring of 1774, wise and thoughtful persons of the American colonies began to realize that war with Great Britain would shortly become the outcome. Oh no! Oh, I have a towel. Oh, I do blame me. It's
Well,
We only have some more napkins.
everything's good.
Everything's good. Oh, thank you very much.
Volunteer doing great.
So it was the spring of 1774, and folks began to realize that that ending the taxation and tyranny of rule by the British was going to lead to conflict. And the feeling was particularly evident in New England, where during the summer and autumn, the people practiced daily military exercises. And in Massachusetts, arrangements were made for the collection of munitions of war and the arming of the people. And December of 1774, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress authorized the enrollment of 12,000 Minutemen. And then Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and other New England colonies also took similar action. And in late 1774, when the king issued his proclamation prohibiting the exportation from Great Britain of military stores, that action led the colonies to immediately start to manufacture gunpowder and cannons. And then throughout the spring of 1775, liberty poles began to be raised and then cut down again. And in March of 1775 in New York, they actually raised the first, for the first time, a Union flag. And that had kind of like a red field backdrop. And then a very interesting phrase, which was George Rex and the liberties of America on one side, and on the other side, no popery. I don't really understand, but I think it means no purity. And then on May 10th of 1775, the Second General Congress of Delegates from several of the colonies assembled in Philadelphia, and they began to discuss the strained relationship with Great Britain. Roger Sherman was then 54 years old and was representing Connecticut as a delegate in the Continental Congress. Colonel George Washington was 43 years old in 1775, and he was the delegate from Virginia. And it was reported that he appeared in the Congress every day wearing his uniform, and that he was over 6 feet tall and very formal and dignified in his manner. And on June 15th of 1775, a resolution was passed by Congress, resolved that a general be appointed to command all the continental forces raised, or to be raised, for the defense of American liberty, that $500 per month be allowed for his pay and expense. And it was after this passage of this resolution that Congress proceeded to the choice of a general, and they chose the general by ballot, and Washington was unanimously elected. And then on June 16th, George Washington vows to enter upon the momentous duty for the support of the glorious cause after he was appointed our first commander-in-chief. On June 17th, the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought, and the British were victorious, although they lost about approximately 1,000 of their troops. And the American side, we only lost, we had 100 dead and 260 approximately wounded, with 30 prisoners taken. And then the following day, the British General Gage in New York, he requested that all vessels be searched for pork, beef, or any kind of flesh provisions which might serve His Majesty's troops. So they started to search all the ships that were coming to New York the day after that Battle of Bunker Hill. Also on June 18th, George Washington wrote a letter to his wife Martha, and he said, "My dearest, I am now set down to write you on a subject which fills me with inexpressible concern, and this concern is greatly aggravated and increased when I reflect upon the uneasiness I know it will give you. It has been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care, and it is necessary for me to proceed immediately to Boston to take upon the command of it. You may believe me, my dear Patsy, when I assure you in the most solemn manner that so far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it, not only from my unwillingness to part with you and the family, but from a consciousness of its being a trust too great for my capacity, and that I should enjoy more real happiness in 1 month with you at home than I have the most distant prospect of finding abroad, if my stay were to be 7 times 7 years. But it has been a kind of destiny that has thrown me upon this service. I shall hope that my undertaking is designed to answer some good purpose." The day after that, June 19, 1775, the Continental Congress directed Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire to send all of their forces to Boston to join the American Army. June 20th, 1775, the Committee of Congress appointed to draft instructions for the Commander-in-Chief reported to Congress and directed Washington to proceed to the colony of Massachusetts Bay to take charge of the Army of the United Colonies. On June 21st, 1775, the Continental Congress told Paul Revere, who was printing the colony's paper money at the time, to not leave his engraving press exposed when he was absent from it. On June 23rd, 1775, General Washington sets off from Philadelphia, and he was accompanied by his military officers. And before they reached Trenton, they were met by a courier bearing dispatches concerning the Battle of Bunker Hill and the fate of that battle. On June 24th, British warships started to fire on Roxbury in Boston, on the south side of Boston Harbor, and they were attempting to burn the town as they had done in Charlestown, but that attempt failed. And then on June 25th, New York was witnessed the dual entry of George Washington arrived in New York on June 25th, as well did the English governor, Tryon, who had arrived in New York actually just the day before that. And the funny thing is that 4 years after, in July of 1779, the same Tryon commanded 2,700 men and raided the Connecticut coast and the ports of New Haven, Fairfield, and Norwalk, destroying like military and public stores and private homes and supply houses. And at that point, they invaded New Haven, and in a 24-hour period, troops advanced all the way to the New Haven Green, came to Roger Sherman's home. Rebecca and the kids had been evacuated, but they came and they stripped all articles of value. So just kind of interesting that George Washington was in New York at the same time as this British governor. In June 26th of 1775, in a reply in an address to him from the Provincial Assembly of New York, George Washington said, "When we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen." And I think that he meant that in becoming soldiers, the American patriots had not forgotten their duties and obligations as citizens. And June 28th, 1775, George Washington arrived here in New Haven at the home of Roger Sherman and for the first time visited Yale College. The patriotic citizens of New Haven, with supreme faith in the righteousness of the cause of their country, they were rallying at New Haven Green to welcome and bid Godspeed to George Washington on his way from Philadelphia to Cambridge to take command of the army. And George Washington paid a visit on the June 28th here to the home of Roger Sherman. And then that night he stayed on the corner here of College and Chapel Street was a tavern owned by Isaac Beers called the Beers Tavern. And he spent the night there. That's where the Taft Hotel is now standing. And early the next morning, he woke up and he reviewed Yale students that were enlisted on the New Haven Green, and then was accompanied by 2 companies of militia in uniform and a body of citizens and Yale students, including Noah Webster, who was playing on his lute as they marched. And they left town to Neck Bridge, and he was accompanied all that way, and then he continued on. On July 1st, 1775, in London, England, General George Gage was ordered to exert every effort, both by land and sea, to subdue the rebellion in the American colonies. July 2nd, George Washington predicted that the American soldier, when properly trained, would afford a happy presage of success in the future. As he neared Boston, George Washington was welcomed with almost continued ovation, according to contemporaneous accounts. One historian named Lossing reported that the commander-in-chief rode a large white horse of Arabian blood, and he was dressed in a blue coat with buff-colored failings, a rich epaulet on each shoulder, buff underdress, and an elegant small sword with a black cockade in his hat. This historian Lossing writes that Washington first assumed the duties of his office on the 3rd of July, 1775. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, a clear, sultry morning, the troops in Cambridge were drawn up in order upon the Common near Harvard University, and they received the commander-in-chief. And accompanied by officers of the army, he walked from his quarters to a venerable elm tree And under its shadow, standing between his staff and the battalions, he drew his sword, made a few appropriate remarks, and formally took command of the Continental Army. Later on, a poet, Oliver Wendell Holmes, would write, "Under the brave old tree, our fathers gathered in arms and swore. They would follow the sign their banners bore and fight till the land was free." On July 5th, 1775, a Virginian delegate to the Continental Congress said, "As our enemies have found we can reason like men, so let us show them that we can fight like men also." And by the end of his first week in command, General George Washington had devoted most of that time in restoring discipline and clothing and arming the troops. The only life-size oil portrait ever made of Roger Sherman, of which we have a replica in the room that's just off the ballroom here, and which I would very much invite you all to check out. It's really cool. Was done by an artist named Ralph Earl, and that was also done in 1775. So if you'd like to see what Roger Sherman looked like when George Washington visited, we have his portrait just in the room adjacent here that you can check it out. That's where I hang my coat every night and I say, I'm gonna do a good job for you tonight, Mr. Sherman. I say that what ended up happening was that the original clubhouse was expanded in 1903 into the room that we're in now. If you were to look at the outside of the building, there's kind of like a rectangular front, and that was an addition as the club grew. And in 1904, the Sons of the American Revolution placed a historical marker on the exterior of our building here, and I think that you must have passed it on your way in, but of course I probably didn't have time to see it. But when it was commemorated, the president of the Union League at that time was Edwin Seneca Greeley, and he gave an address on the occasion, probably like right where we are right now. And what he said was, "Compatriots, ladies and citizens of New Haven, we're assembled here today to witness the unveiling of a memorial tablet erected by the Connecticut Society Sons of the American Revolution in commemoration of that great merchant, statesman, and patriot, Roger Sherman, who was a resident of this city for the last 32 years of his life, years full of great activity and achievement. Rising from the humblest ranks by his own effort in every upward step, he kept his head clear and his heart pure, wearing his honors meekly and for the public good, with the mind ever receptive of the truth, loving justice, and resolute in maintaining good, overthrowing error, and with remarkable logic, and yet tolerant of weakness and error in others. The site has been selected upon which to place this memorial because this building covers a part of the site of the house owned and occupied by Roger Sherman." And in speaking of the tablet, which I would encourage you to maybe have a look at later, General Greeley said, "Of first importance is the inscription, which is the memorial feature of the tablet. This must be historically true and of simple and correct composition. Even the lettering must be chosen in reference to the character of the subject and the period of his service. The language of the memorial should be always declarative and never apologetic or explanatory. The design of this Roger Sherman memorial was suggested by an old colonial doorway of fine lines and proportion, and may be said to indicate the hospitality of the Sherman House in New Haven. The lettering of the design was suggested from the title page of a book printed in New England in 1775, the rugged and open character of which seems in good keeping with the same qualities of Sherman's life, and it seems fortunate that the handsome and substantial character of the building upon which this tablet rests is so well in keeping with the enduring bronze of which it is made." Well, thank you all so much for having me today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.